There's this weird thing about sports. And it goes a little something like this. You need to play with great effort, intensity. You need to try hard, but when you try too hard, oftentimes the opposite of the intended effect takes place. And I think Dan Byer, by the way, is the best golfer among us. I think he could probably attest to this. The golf analogy is probably the best, which is you get up to the tee and you want to hit it a long way. And the common thought of any human being is, well, if I swing harder, the ball will go further, right? If I swing harder, the ball will go further. That's what most people think. And there's a deal with golf. Yes, the velocity of your swing, the swing speed is at least a portion of the calculation in regards to how far the golf ball goes. But if you get out of rhythm, if your club is ahead of the shaft or behind the shaft because you're swinging so hard and it gets whippy, if you don't have the right shaft firmness for your type of swing, if your rhythm is off, and basically you swing too hard, and all of us have done it, that sucker ends up way right, and you're like, wait a second, I hit it, it sounded pure, I swung hard, that doesn't make sense. Happens in tennis. And I know a lot of you have transitioned or skipped over the whole tennis thing because tennis is harder than pickleball. But trust me, I've played tennis a lot. And they talk about hitting out in tennis, right? But there's a magic to it, right? What percentage of hitting as hard as you can you actually keep the tennis ball on the court? Right? Because there's this like line there. Happens in baseball. Yes, the exit velo is greater if you swing as hard as you can, but you have to load, okay? And you have to have a certain rhythm, and you want to hit it with all of your force at the very right moment, and you got to make sure that you make contact on the barrel. Okay? You have to use your legs and your hips, but if you swing too hard too soon, one, you miss it, and two, oftentimes you'll just pull it into the home team's dugout. In basketball, when you're told this team can't score, you guys can't shoot, and you try and prove somebody wrong, there's a limit there to where you try too hard. And look, it's a guy thing too. You know the guy that shows up and he walks in and instead of just that one spray of cologne, he's got 3 sprays of cologne. You want to know what the women think? He's trying too hard. Compensating for something. Right? The $30,000 millionaire in Dallas or in Cali that drives around with a super, super fancy souped up car because he's covering for the fact that, well, maybe his body wasn't constructed the way other men were constructed, or maybe he doesn't really have a great job at home, but he's trying to front like he does. Look, Virginia didn't belong in the NCAA tournament. I'm not one of these guys that usually says your performance in the NCAA tournament is either validation or invalidation for your entry to the tournament. But when the numbers and such a feeling of, I love Tony Bennett, I like that program, but man, Ken Palm before the night had you at 69. When we watch you and we're like, I just don't see it. And then you play as poorly as they played last night, everyone, even the people like myself who say, look, your performance in the tournament doesn't validate whether or not you should get in. If it did, well, look at the upsets. You know, didn't Purdue lose to FDU last year? Fairly ridiculous university, didn't they? Did that mean they didn't belong in the tournament? Of course not. They played a bad game against a team that played out of their minds. But when Virginia struggles to score all year long, when they have these long droughts all season long within their games to score the basketball, when their defense is not nearly as good as it has been regarded in the past, and then you try and compensate or overcompensate, it just got worse. Like, look, Virginia wasn't great, probably didn't belong in the tournament. I would have rather seen Indiana State. You could make a case for a whole bunch of other teams that were as or maybe more deserving, whatever. But they're not as bad as they played last night. It's the snowball effect. It's the fancy car effect. It's the golf swing effect. Where when things start going bad and you try harder and harder and harder and harder and harder, and it just snowballs on you and nobody can make a shot. It is the absolute worst feeling. It's the worst. And I know that people like to say, well, Tony Bennett's teams don't score. Well, when they won the national championship, they averaged 71.5 points per game. This year, 63. And as good as they are thought to be defensively, this was not, the defensive metrics told you this was not a great defensive team. And when you go 10 minutes without scoring, there's no question that that mental side to it comes into effect. Mental side to it. Like, I watched, people forget this, okay? When Villanova won their first national championship under Jay Wright, not the Raleigh Massimino 88 one, okay, the one under Jay Wright. Does anybody remember what happened in the semifinals of the Final Four? Buyer, any recollection at all for what this is not a quiz. You're not a bad person, or it's not, you know a ton of stuff. So don't feel bad. I'm asking you on the spot.
No, I don't know what you're getting at.
They played Oklahoma. They rematched with Oklahoma, who beat them badly in Hawaii in the regular season. They beat Oklahoma by 44 points in the national semifinal. Okay? 44 points. They humiliated Oklahoma. As Buddy Hield was on that team. Right? Remember, this is the year where they played in Houston. Right? And Chris Jenkins hit the shot to win it. That was the North Carolina. That was the championship game. The semifinals was against Oklahoma. And honestly, an Oklahoma team who was a great shooting team, the exact same thing happened. Exact same thing happened. Where they got behind, they couldn't make a shot, they couldn't get a stop, and it just snowballed on them. And a great team, and this is obviously not a classically great team, but a great team was made to look like, why was Oklahoma even here? How did they get to this game? Why would anybody talk about Oklahoma? Right? And the reason is, right? The reason is because Villanova took out all that angst and energy and got a lead. And as it got bad, they were trying harder and harder and harder. And there is, in fact, a mental thing with, and again, I just think the golf analogy is the best one. Sometimes trying so hard to prove somebody wrong or to make a point ends up being the exact opposite way to be successful. So that was bad last night. And, look, this is how it works in the sport, which is we all want confirmation bias. If you didn't think Virginia belonged in the tournament, there's your confirmation against Colorado State. If you thought Colorado State was underseeded, there's your confirmation. The problem with it is, this is the problem, is we will make the exact opposite argument, or we won't make that argument tonight. Like Boise State, they're sitting there going like, man, we're in the Mountain West. Why are we in the play-in game? If Boise gets beaten, they won't get beat as bad. If they get beat, it won't be as bad as last night. But if they get beat, no one's going to say, hey, Boise didn't belong in because they got beat. But that was a bad one. That was how the hell they get here. boy, that was a mistake. Yikes. Why are they in the tournament? I look at it differently now. I look at it as the reality of the sport is that it has changed dramatically. Okay? Tony Bennett, and you may not love that style. You may not want to cheer for that style. You may not want your kid to play that style. It's just different. It's almost like you have to prorate somebody's stats playing at Virginia. By the way, just so you know, Tony Bennett also coached a guy who is a pretty good offensive player. His name's Klay Thompson. You guys ever heard of Klay Thompson? He's had a decent career. He coached him at Washington State, took Washington State to the Sweet 16. He took a dormant Virginia program and made it into a national power and a national champion. So it's not like the guy's an idiot. It's not like he forgot how to coach. This batch just wasn't that good and had these long droughts offensively. And the reality of it is, when you have a school that, while they have a gigantic endowment, believes in their academic mission as much as their athletic mission, this is what it looks like. What a bad day for the ACC as well, huh? And the Atlantic Coast Conference, if you just put it on paper, and I said this, okay, if you're just close your eyes for a second, well, not if you're driving, okay, but maybe get lost in thought for a second. I said one league has Syracuse, Duke, Carolina, Louisville, Virginia, who else? NC State, Wake Forest, Pittsburgh. Like, you're like, wait, one league? Yes. You'd be like, that's as good a basketball league as I've ever heard. And yet the league is crummy right now. Why? Well, you have a lot of either small private schools, Wake Forest, one of the smallest Division I schools. Okay. Boston College, fairly small as well. You kind of go through all these different schools, small privates, or elite academic schools. Carolina's an elite academic school. Duke's an elite academic school, also small private. Virginia, elite academic school. They have two things going against them. They don't have a depth of donors to call on to help them with football and basketball. And then they have a lot of academics who graduated like Virginia degree is worth way more than anything we give in NIL. That's not what we're about. And then you have people at the university campus like, look, you can take transfers, but they got to get in. Many of these schools don't take online classes. They don't transfer. I don't know if you know this, if you have a college student, let alone a college student athlete, but a lot of kids don't ever step foot on campus anymore, especially athletes. So it's hard to get them a lot of the transfers. They don't have a bunch of NIL, and you don't get players that stay 3 or 4 years. And oh yeah, by the way, when you don't have hot NIL and you have a reputation of not playing fast, it's hard to get kids, even if you recruit high-level kids, to get them to stay. So the sustainability of Virginia basketball in the future is very much in doubt if Virginia doesn't make some changes. But for last night, that was confirmation bias to any of us who thought Virginia didn't belong in. Sadly so. I do think it snowballed and looked way worse. The difference between those two teams is not 25 points. It's not, hey, they can't score 40 against them. It was just brutal. And oh yeah, by the way, in a year in which the women's game has attracted a lot of attention because of the star power that they have. Look, and we don't pay attention to the fact that the women's game, you get out of those top 5, top 10 teams, and it's equally horrific, equally trash. Those are 2 bad basketball games. And made even worse by the fact that you got Virginia, someone who won a national championship in the last 6-7 years, looking that bad, that inept, that non-competitive with Colorado State. What is that, by the way, about, Dan, with swinging a golf club where the harder you swing, the worse it gets?
Your muscles. Yeah, everything tightens up. It's better for it to be elastic and loose. You get more of that lag. And, yeah, that's exactly what it is. so difficult.
It's so
yes.
It's so frustrating, right? So frustrating.
Yeah.
Right?
And pros can obviously swing hard as well, but they are, really good at it and their muscles aren't clenching up. We think swinging hard is.
Yes. Yes. And that happens in basketball, right? Lots of things spread in basketball. Selfishness spreads in basketball. Unselfishness spreads in basketball. And when dudes are missing shots, like everybody starts missing shots. It's just crazy how that stuff works.